everybody. Welcome to our Easter edition of Sunday Unpacked. This is Monica, and I'm here with Pastor James. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to be together after this really nice Easter weekend that we had at church. I'm thankful for all that happened this weekend.
Yeah, it was really good. I especially liked the Good Friday service and all of the different stations we had.
Yeah, it
Those
was a
were,
little different, and I think that was a positive thing for me
hmm
personally and for us as a church.
yeah, my husband was still talking about that today.
Yeah.
Um, I did notice Sunday that the graphic for our Sunday Unpacked still has the wrong phone number on it. So I just want to
Yeah, I
make
think it
sure
was just
people
an
have,
old graphic. Yeah.
yeah, that I want to make sure people have the right phone number to text their questions to. And that would be 404-565-4498. And you can email your questions at taylorvillechristian.com. And there's still a place on the Connect card where you can fill out your questions and hand them in. So,
Right.
did you have anything to add about the Sunday sermon?
Yeah, we did have a little trouble on our streaming computer Sunday. So if you're watching online or even try to watch it later, there's some pieces missing, but we got as much as we could backed up on the church website. But and we could potentially have a little trouble this week too. But we've got some things ordered to fix that. So hopefully by the following week we will be back up to full speed. So sorry about that glitchiness, but sometimes these things happen and we just have to replace some equipment. But that's important, and we want to make sure people who watch online can access it, and then people who watch later can get it too. But the
Yeah.
audio
And
recordings are all on there and ready to go.
yeah, I was going to say, I know I listened to Good Friday's sermon again Saturday when I was
Right.
working on some, or Sunday morning before church. So, um, yeah, the story of God's love and, how Abraham's promise culminates with Jesus and Jesus' birth and then his death, burial, and resurrection is still a story worth talking about. And that's
Right.
what you
And
preached on Sunday.
officially we were sort of taking a week off from that, but it was still all right there. I mean,
It
we didn't
was.
I didn't mention it directly, but it's definitely
It
what
is.
we were
Yeah.
discussing is still the same thing. Yes.
Right. And the Easter story, it's so familiar, I think, to everybody. Growing up in school, I remember my friends who went to a different church would come to school with ashes on their forehead, and I didn't understand
Right.
that that had to do with Easter. And as I grew up, I learned that. They were Catholic
Yeah.
and I was Baptist, so I didn't know. I didn't understand Lent. And
Yeah.
I think it really has a good place, a good purpose.
Well,
Um,
some of these practices, even though like they don't show up in the Bible, they can still
mhm.
be valuable to us, recognizing what they are and what they're for in helping us devote something of ourselves to God in a special way, whether we're talking about Lent or preparing for Christmas with Advent or other holidays that come along during the year. I mean, none of these holidays show up in the Bible itself, right? We don't see some
Right.
point at which they celebrate Easter in the book of Acts. They celebrated the resurrection of Christ every Sunday. But that doesn't mean it's bad to spend this particular Sunday remembering that Christ was raised from the dead. So I think those can play an important part. It's sort of that rhythm of walking through the year and remembering some important parts of Jesus' life or other parts of the Bible can be healthy for us.
Right. So, are there any common misconceptions about Easter and the week preceding that we could address here? I know I grew up thinking that that the Last Supper was on Friday evening, and following that,
Yeah,
Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, and then he was arrested, and then he died on Friday night. And I remember the
right.
first time that timeline didn't make sense to me.
Yeah,
So,
right.
if anybody else is going through that, can you kind of walk through that? What
Yeah,
happens?
and I mean, part of what we're dealing with is the general struggle of studying anything about Jesus' life because we're talking about four different accounts of the same life in a big picture, but even specific events um, in a sort of more direct, detailed picture. So, and sometimes they show up in different places in Jesus' life, or are told slightly different, or Jesus says something in one of the Gospels. He says it in a different setting and maybe in a slightly different way in another one of the Gospels. And I mean, what we need to understand is each one of these guys writes with their own perspective. They didn't have the same sense of importance of organizing material on a timeline like we do. Not that they weren't being honest, but sometimes they organize things thematically, and it's just a different way of thinking about it. But especially when we get to the last week of Jesus' life, there is a lot of material in all the Gospels on that last week. I mean, for some of the Gospels, what we would call Holy Week, um, takes up half the gospel. So there's a ton of
Hmm.
material to sort of piece together in that way, and that can happen even on the last couple days. So the Last Supper is on Thursday. Although if you read John, it's a little harder to see for sure whether that's even the same meal or slightly different time. Some of that's a little harder to put together, but then certainly we see Jesus sort of tried overnight, and then by 9 o'clock the next morning Jesus is on the cross, and by 3 he's dead. So I mean, those are the big pieces, but there's a
Yeah.
lot of other details to fill in along the way.
So the Last Supper was on Thursday night, correct? Yes.
That's correct. Yes, yes.
And is that why some churches celebrate or observe what we call Maundy Thursday?
It is. I mean, Maundy Thursday sometimes can be in a bit of a reenactment of the Last Supper. It can take some of the pieces of the Last
Okay.
Supper and put them into a worship service. Sometimes Maundy Thursday will include what's called a tenebrae service, which is a service of darkness. So it ends in complete darkness, to signify the darkness of
Hmm.
all these events. I mean, there's a lot of pieces that can be involved in that. It's been a while since I've been to a Maundy Thursday service, but they can really be meaningful. So a lot of churches, I think the Lutheran church just down the street from us had a Thursday night, Maundy Thursday service, a Good Friday service on Friday, and maybe even a Holy Saturday service Saturday evening. So, it can be done in lots of different ways.
Would you ever consider doing a Maundy Thursday service
Yeah, it's
or
something we
event?
haven't really talked about doing. It's not that we like are opposed. We
Hmm.
just haven't done it. So, I mean, I think it is something we could think about.
So Good Friday service was I that's probably the best Good Friday service I've ever been to in
It was
my
really meaningful to me too.
um,
Yeah.
50 years of what I can remember of Good Friday
Right.
services. So it was very good. What was your favorite part about the Good Friday service?
Well, I think anytime people in church come down front and we're involved in something, and I get to be like literally, I have a front row seat to that, because I usually
Mhm.
sit down front.
Yeah.
And so when people came and, we all basically took something that we feel like separates us from God and we put it on the cross, that was really meaningful to me. I mean, I don't need to read anybody's, but just that we all recognize there's not a single person in the room who stands any different from anyone else. We are all sinners who have something to
Right.
bring to the cross every day, but certainly every year as we think about Good Friday and our role in putting Jesus on the cross. So that was really meaningful to me to see so many people come forward and
It really
participate in
was.
that.
Yeah. I was very sad that I took notes on the back of mine because I didn't have any other paper. And so I
Oh
needed
no,
those
so it's
notes to
on
come
the
up with questions. So,
yeah.
yeah, so
Oh
I
no.
think I know, I was like, "I can't take this down there. I want to, but I can't." So, but I did
Right.
a kind of after I rewrote my notes, I did kind of a personal prayer time of surrendering it and you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Sure, and that's
I
what really
did take
matters.
care of it at home and do what we were supposed to do, put it at the feet of Jesus or nailed it on the
Yep.
cross, in my spirit. So Good Friday, you preached on Mark 15, which begins with Jesus being led before the chief priests. Yeah, it begins with the chief priests and the elders who had made their
Yeah, the
plans.
Sanhedrin. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So are there significant acts aspects of their plans that we didn't get to hear about or discuss?
Well, I
Like,
mean, clearly the point is they want him dead, right? I mean, they see Jesus
yeah.
as a threat. He is a threat in a number of ways, especially for the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the wealthy class. They're the people who, in many ways, have placed themselves in league with Rome. Um, they are the religious leaders in that they are the priests. I mean, there's other religious leaders like the Pharisees who are more experts in the law. But the Sadducees have position, they have power, and Jesus is sort of threatening to not necessarily unseat them, but to challenge the balance of power. And they like things the way they are. They want to keep the status quo. Well, Jesus is obviously pressing against that and creating something new. And they do not want that. So they would like to see Jesus dead. So that's their goal from the outset of all this, is to make sure Jesus is killed, and is killed by Rome, to make it clear that he is rejected by Jews and Gentiles.
So the crowd that was there, were they the same crowd that was laying palm branches at the feet of Jesus on Palm Sunday? Or was
Of
this a
course, we can't
totally
know for
different group of
sure,
people?
but yeah, I think we're probably looking at a mixture of that. Okay, so you got for this week, for the Passover feast, you have people who would have made a pilgrimage from various parts of the Roman Empire. So you have Jews who are local in Judea, and you have Jews coming from various places where there are large populations in places like Alexandria and in Rome, um, coming to Jerusalem. Some of these people, this would be the one time in their life when they would actually get to Jerusalem for the Passover. Some of them were able to do this frequently. So they're there to celebrate. Hey, for us, it would be July 4th, right? It's Independence Day. It's the day they got out of Egypt, the day they were slaves
Mhm.
no longer. Um,
Right.
and so on Sunday, you have Jesus being celebrated as this hero who, in this week of independence, is maybe he's going to overthrow Roman rule. Maybe this is what the prophets had been pointing to. He's going to be the fulfillment of all that. And by the end of the week, they're convinced that he is not that in the way they expected. He's not going to raise up an army. He's not going to take on the Romans. And so they are disillusioned, and they fall into the same crowd that wants Jesus dead. Now, is it all the same people? I don't know. But my guess is there's probably a lot of the same people, both
Hmm.
locals and from other
Okay.
places, who are disillusioned in what Jesus is creating because it's not what they wanted.
Yeah. I think that's a valid point, and something very important to remember is that most of the people, even Jesus' disciples, were expecting a physical takeover um,
Yeah,
of
right,
the Roman Empire. And that's not what Jesus came for.
right.
He didn't come to set them free physically. I mean, except for healing and stuff like that. But he did come to set them free spiritually from the
Well,
laws of
sure,
sin
but
and death.
right, he didn't come to raise
But
up an
they
army,
didn't see
and
that.
that's what they wanted at that point.
Right. That's
Correct.
what they wanted. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm going to take this moment to tell you that your video is lagging a lot. Am I lagging for you?
Well, yours is too. Even
Like
your
my
audio
video,
is. Yeah,
is it
my
lagging?
guess is we're going to be okay.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, everything is. It records
Okay.
things separately, so my guess is
Okay.
we'll be all right. But I'll
Okay.
probably have
So,
to listen to it afterwards to be sure.
yeah.
So we'll just
Okay.
keep
And
going
that
and
was
hope for the
the
best.
14-minute mark is where you'll need to
Okay, I'll know
probably
where to
edit that
go.
out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So we kind of often ease past the brutality of the crucifixion, and we seldom delve into the true graphic depiction of all that occurred.
Right.
Um, but as you said, Friday evening and a little bit on Sunday morning, the people in Jesus' day knew. They knew what a crucifixion was and how brutal it
They had
was.
seen it. The Romans made it very public. It was on the roads into cities so that when you
Yeah.
went by, you would witness this. They were making an example of people. So everyone knew what this looked like.
Do you feel like in our day and in our reality and basically in our lives of entitlement that we can ever get a true picture, a true grasp of what the mental anguish, the humiliation, the physical exhaustion, and the floggings? I mean, like, I can't even imagine. I don't like to see kids spanked. You know, I
Right.
can't imagine seeing um, this uh, leader who brought so much peace to people and watching him take all of this. I mean, do you think we
Well,
can
I
grasp it and understand?
in some ways, I hope we don't, because that would
Yeah.
mean that we had descended into a violent culture that would be
Mhm.
more like the Romans than like what most of us have lived in. And I don't really want for us to be that familiar with this kind of brutality. Hopefully, we don't ever get there. But that leaves us, in some ways, at a bit of a distance from the reality of what a crucifixion looks like. And, I've heard plenty of talks about, getting into some of those literally gory details of what a crucifixion was like. And I think there's a place for that. But it's also more than that. I don't like to get too caught up in just that, because then that ends up being all that people think about. And there's really a lot more to the story as well. But we do need to be aware that this was terribly brutal. I mean, it was designed to be a
Mhm.
horrific way to die. I mean, that's why they created it. So Jesus endured all that, and he did it for us. And I think that's the key there, is remembering that. But it is graphically brutal if you think about it very much.
Yeah. What was Jesus' physical condition before he came to Pilate and the Roman guards in Mark 15 through
Well,
20?
the crucifixion was certainly
Well,
not
I
the
mean, he
only
came to
hard
them
part of
in
this, right?
15, but huh?
Right.
Yeah.
Um, it's more than just the crucifixion itself. So Jesus faces sort of an informal beating as the hearing in front of the Sanhedrin comes to an end. Then he takes the official flogging, which preceded crucifixion, by the Roman authorities. Pilate orders that. So, and that often killed people. So Jesus could have died just from that itself, tearing into flesh. And then after that, when the crown of thorns is put on his head, the robe is put on his back, it says they beat him about the head with a staff or a reed of some kind. So Jesus has been through all of that before they even go to the Mount of Crucifixion. So he's in horrible shape, not to mention the fact that he's had this emotionally and physically exhausting night before any of that happens, because it's clear he doesn't sleep. So he stays up all night. He's praying. He's in emotional agony, great drops of blood, um,
Yeah.
thinking about carrying the sin of humanity, thinking about the physical pain he's going to go through. So he's in bad shape before he gets to Pilate, and he's in worse shape before he goes off to be crucified. So he's in a very difficult position before he even gets on the cross.
Yeah. Um, Gethsemane in Mark 14:32 through 34. That is, for me, a really emotional uh, part of the story to read. When it says that he was deeply
It is.
distressed and overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And, I've said for several years now, I feel like um, Gethsemane is where Jesus submitted or surrendered to the crucifixion. That's where he crucified his flesh and um, he knew what
Yeah.
was coming. And I feel like that is part of what made the physical, I don't want to say easier to endure, but it made it possible to endure because he had already surrendered before that,
Right.
that whatever the cost to his physical body, he was going to pay the price for the sins of humanity. I feel like that was Gethsemane is where
Yeah.
that took place, that surrender and that
And
dying
I
to
think about
flesh,
that.
that fleshly part of him.
Right. And you're certainly not wrong. I think about where Jesus made this decision. And I think we could
Mhm.
point to several places, and I don't know that it's like one of these and not the others. So I would just maybe add to what you said, not to take away from it.
Yeah.
But in some ways, you could point to creation itself. I mean, we know from John that Jesus is present in creation. We know that we're talking about an all-knowing God, a God who knew what was going to happen, that there was going to be sin and that he was going to deal with sin in this way. So even as human beings are being brought into existence, Jesus knew the price of that. Or we might be able to think about some of these promises that were made to Abraham that we've talked about over the last few weeks, that as Abraham hears that all nations are going to be blessed through Jesus, well, that means that are blessed through his descendants. And Jesus is one of those descendants. That's how all nations are blessed, through Abraham. Um, so even as those promises are made to Abraham, Jesus, the Son of God, knows what that means. We could think about when he chooses to become a human being. He's born. Well, that's a beautiful story that we talk about at Christmas, but it's headed toward this. And we could think
Mhm.
about the garden. We could think about different times during his ministry too. I think for sure, as you've said, it all comes to a head right there. Right? I mean, he knows what's
Mhm.
about to happen. He knows the physical, emotional, spiritual agony he's about to endure, and even as he prays that that cup would pass from him, he chooses to do it, and he goes forward with it,
Mhm.
and he submits to what God's called him to do. So the garden, at the least, is a clear point where he reaffirms his commitment to God's plan. Maybe it was made before. I think it's pretty easy to argue that he's very aware of it before, but this is the moment where he's got to
Right.
decide yes or no, because once you go forward, it's headed toward the cross. So it is a key moment in that spiritual struggle that Jesus goes through.
Yeah. So one of my favorite parts about the the Easter story, and you mentioned it, the when the temple veil or the curtain was torn in two from top to bottom at the moment of Jesus' death,
Right.
and I just find that fascinating because at one time I did a study on the temple and the tabernacle and just what the the physical um, attributes were, I guess, or the physical
Mm-hmm.
part of that veil and how it relates to the story of Abraham, too, to us. But the veil itself was 60 feet wide, 30 feet high, and 4 inches thick. I just think that's amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
huge. Yeah, I mean, it's a big room that becomes two rooms because this veil covers the
mhm,
whole. It basically is a wall in this room.
mhm, yeah. And I love how you kind of drew on the story of God's love from Abraham to us because in Abraham's time, well, it was Moses, and after that they did the sacrifice. But even in making the covenant with Abraham, God had to sacrifice animals for that promise, to signify that promise. And that animal sacrifice was no longer going to be needed, that Jesus was the final sacrifice to God fulfilling his promise. And then his God's spirit was going to flood all over the world as that curtain was torn away. That really, like in my mind, I could just see it happening. I thought it was really, really cool. Let's
Well, and
see.
it's
And Good
striking
Friday.
because you
Yeah,
have
go ahead.
Jesus. You have Jesus sort of his through his death. This curtain is torn, and it opens this up in a way that we become the temple. I mean, it's not that the
Yeah.
temple is still there and needed. It's that human beings become. We are a royal priesthood. Everything that happened in the temple happens when Christians gather. The sacrifice has already been made, so we don't have to do that, but we
Mm-hmm.
celebrate what Christ has done. And yeah, the Spirit of God fills his people and spreads all over the earth. So no longer is God's presence focused in one city and one place, one holy spot, but wherever a Christian goes, the temple goes with them. Wherever a Christian goes, the
Yeah.
royal priesthood goes with them. And I think it's a whole different view of God's presence at work in the world. And I think that's a powerful thing for us to get, that we are God's
Yeah.
temple at work in the world.
And there's no longer separation between us and God, because
Correct.
the purpose of the veil,
Correct.
the way it was hung, protected the priests when they served before God, because God's presence was behind the veil in the Holy of Holies, right? The most holy place. But they
Correct.
served
Yes.
outside of that, they served the people before God. And one time a year, on one specific day, a priest could go, the high priest, only the high priest, could go behind the veil. And not only that, but he had to have a rope tied around his waist. Am I correct about that? In case he had
That's
sins he
right.
hadn't atoned for. And so they could drag him out if he
Yeah.
died before the presence of God because he had sinned.
Right.
That
Or
just and
because
then
he died for any other reason. Yeah. I
yeah,
mean,
and that's no longer an issue. We can come before God as we are, and he's gonna Jesus, because of Jesus, we can just go to God as we are, and he'll forgive our sins and cleanse us and make us right, to make us
right.
holy like him. And it's so amazing to me to see how God made it so personal through Jesus. And I just think that's amazing. And like you said, now we can be the
Well, it is.
temple
And you've
and go
got
to the
this.
world.
Yeah, you've got this with the high priest that, I mean, if he dies, nobody can go in that room to retrieve him. So
Right.
you got to have a way to get him out. So tie that rope around him. And the idea that we are always in the presence of God. God's spirit is always at
Hmm.
work in his people. I mean, it's a beautiful part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, that
Hmm.
God's spirit is going with you wherever you are. That's a great thing to know.
Um, Good Friday sermon. To review the bottom line of that, Jesus is the King of the Jews. And even though Jesus' death felt like defeat, it was not. And his death changed everything. Um, it fulfilled God's promise to Abraham to bless the world through him. No one else's death altered our relationship with God, um, as evidenced by the rendering of the curtain in the temple. And we have access to God through Jesus Christ. And because of his great love, he invites us into his story, his relevant for today story, which leads
Yeah.
us to Sunday's sermon. Um, um, that we still talk about Jesus today because it's still relevant for today, and it is a story that's worth talking about today. Um, there was kind of something new that you talked about on Sunday the explanation of the tomb and the burial practices to me. It was really cool. It kind of clarified to me why the man would have the tomb ready anyway. And then when you talked about the stone being rolled down in front of that 2 by 2 hole, and it was kind of in a crevice. So not only was it a heavy stone, but they had to push it out of this crevice. So it really would have been taken a lot to get that moved.
It would have. I mean, it would have been a real challenge for two people of any, whoever they were, and much less two
Right.
women. So it is a striking thing that they're going, wondering whether they're going to be able to move this tomb. So I move this stone. One thing I want to back up on just for a
Yeah,
second
sure.
is you talk about Friday feeling like a bit of a defeat, and we do feel that way, and
Mhm.
I think the disciples felt that way. But one of my
Oh,
favorite
yeah.
verses to think about that is in Colossians chapter 2. Um, and let me just back up from that verse to 2:13. Paul says, when you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which is sort of like the sign above Jesus' head, charging him with being king of the Jews, which stood against us
Mhm.
and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And then this verse, having
Mhm.
disarmed the powers and authorities at the cross, not in his resurrection, but at the cross, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. It is as if he's saying, this seemed like a defeat. In fact, all of the powers of evil were at work in the world thinking that it was a defeat, but clearly it was not, because we're headed to the empty tomb, because we're headed to Sunday morning. So even on the cross, as it looked like a defeat for Jesus, looked like a defeat for the apostles, looks like a defeat to us, it's not, because there is resurrection and there is an empty
Mhm.
tomb. And those women, they were the first ones to witness this. So it's a powerful thing when we
Yeah.
get there.
Yeah. That Colossians 2:14 that you just read, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, um, nailing it to the cross. I love that. I'm glad you went back and
It's
added
a
that in because I just
powerful
love that
verse. Yeah,
verse. It is. It is so powerful. And it's like at that moment on the cross, Jesus won. He paid for our
right.
sins at that time. We just recognize it
That's right.
at the resurrection.
And to even
And
back up from
so
that to
that's
what we've been talking about,
powerful.
um, when we think about all that we've talked about with the story of God's love, that we were created in God's image to reflect God's image to the world, and that we mess that up through our sin. I mean, part of what we're saying on the cross is Jesus is forgiving us so that once again we can reflect the image of God, so that we can do what we were created to do. So, I mean, part of what I'm getting at is these are not just disjointed stories meandering through human history, but that God is at work on this plan from the beginning, and from the beginning of human sin through Jesus to us and into eternity.
Mhm.
So we keep coming back to that in this series, that God has a plan and God is working his plan. But the truth is, we can't get very far from it because it's the theme that runs through the whole Bible. So we'll keep coming back to that. But it's so
Yeah.
clear here at this point, the crucifixion and the resurrection.
Wow. I just I love Sunday Unpacked. It makes my week. I just learned so much, and I hope our listeners are too. But I just love to just get in and talk about this, and just have the sscriptures come alive as I'm just sitting here in this room and
There's a
talking
lot
about it.
here. Yeah.
And you know, There is a verse that says that uh, that the word is strong and sharp as a double-edged sword, and I just can feel the power of the scriptures when we talk about it, and it gets me excited. I don't know if that makes me kind of a nerd or what, but I'll take it because it makes my
That's all
day.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so, um, going to the tomb, and the burial place, you talked about the burial practices and how the bodies were taken in there and they were wrapped in these spices because they didn't do embalming, and they would seal the tomb for a year and then they would come and get it and take it out. And that was the first time when you were talking about that it really hit me that this tomb was unused. There are scriptures that talk about the tomb being unused, that he had just had this tomb prepared. And is it important that the tomb was unused, and why would it be important that the tomb was unused?
Well, yeah, I think it is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, this tomb has been untouched by death, so that it's not been touched by the
Right.
death of any other person, and Jesus' death is different from everyone else's. So this is unique in human history, but also to the point that okay, if no one else is buried here, then there's no confusion about whose body is missing, right? So part of
Mhm.
the core of this story is everyone knew where they had put Jesus' body. And then on Sunday, everyone knows the same tomb is empty. There's this fact that we have to grapple with of Jesus is raised from the dead. And I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday that noted there's two things that work together here that you have to have both. One is yes, the tomb is empty. And the second is there are appearances of Jesus. So if you have either one of those without the other, then things aren't going to work. So if the tomb is just empty and we never hear anything about Jesus after that, well, maybe the tomb's just been robbed. Or if you have appearances of Jesus and the tomb is not empty, then Jesus is a ghost or these are apparitions of some kind. It's just a spiritual experience. But what we have are both together, meaning that Jesus' actual physical body was raised from the dead.
Mm.
And that is at the core of what it means to follow Jesus, is to recognize he was raised from the dead, and that confirms his identity as both the Son of God and the Messiah. And so his death and resurrection changes everything for us. So I think it does matter that this is a new tomb, unused, and that's why the gospel writers bring that out.
Yeah. And I don't think that Mark brought that out, but I think a couple of the other gospel
Yeah,
writers did,
you're right.
correct? I don't remember.
Right, correct.
Yeah. So, speaking of Mark's version of the Gospels versus the other Gospels, why was his response of the women who went to the tomb and found it empty so different from the other Gospels?
Well, that speaks to a much bigger issue, which is the ending of Mark. So let's talk about that for a
Right.
minute. Um,
Okay.
So this all goes back to a whole field of study that's called textual criticism. And what that means is not really criticizing the Bible, but it's trying to get the best text of the New Testament or the Old Testament for that matter that we can possibly get. So everything we have are copies of what was actually written. Usually copies of copies of copies. So we have a few little fragments that go back to the first century and more as we move on through history. And so part of what the scholars have to do is to compare all those different copies of whatever book you're talking about. And we're talking about Mark. And so Mark ends pretty abruptly. Now, as you go through history and see those copies of copies, some copies of Mark are longer. And you wonder, well, why do we have more at the ending of Mark? Well, it seems that probably scribes who were copying Mark thought, well, that ended sort of abruptly. Why is there not more like there is in the other gospels? And they probably wrote a little footnote and filled in some blanks, not intending to say, okay, I'm going to finish Mark for him, but to give their readers more information. Well, the next copyist comes along and he's got to decide, well, is that part of Mark or is that something somebody's added in? So then somebody else copies that one, and you can see how it comes down the line. The oldest ones that we have only go to Mark 16, verse 8, which is an abrupt ending. The other gospels give us much more after Jesus' resurrection. So, what do we have going on here? Some scholars believe Mark just wanted it to be shorter, and he does intend a lot of times to be shorter than the other gospels. Other scholars believe, well, maybe, and these were usually in scrolls at this time, maybe the end of the Mark scroll got ripped and it disappeared. And so when people came along to copy it, they're just copying what was left, which ends at Mark 16, verse 8. So it is different in that it is much shorter than the rest of the Gospels on what happens after the resurrection. So there's that big difference that we see in Mark. But specifically, why does it sound different concerning different facts? Well, again, we're talking about the gospel writers investigating this, listening to the stories. And so when they hear that, they're going to tell the different stories from different perspectives. Now, that doesn't mean one's right and one's wrong, but as with anything in the gospels, as we've talked about, sometimes different people tell the story. And so you get a different perspective on that story. That doesn't mean one is truthful and one is not truthful. It means that they're told from a different perspective. Just like if you and I tell the same story, it's not going to come out in exactly the same words. What that points to is that this is real people telling a real story, just like it would be now. So I think it really speaks to the reality of what happens, not that there are real big problems. But it does give us a shorter ending, which means that these women are left in 16:8 not saying anything to anyone. Well, in all the other gospels, they do talk. So why does Mark say they don't? Well, my guess is this is at that moment, the initial recognition that Jesus' body has been raised and they've seen an angel scares them to death, which probably would me too. I get that. And so at
Oh,
first,
yeah.
they don't know exactly what to say. Maybe they're even thinking, who in the world is going to believe us if we start telling this story? And in fact, Luke tells us that some people didn't believe them. So all that makes sense. And, there's a question of how many women are going. Well, just because one person names one person doesn't mean he's saying, well, there was not three, there's only one. He's just naming one of them. So lots of things going on there. And again, it just points to the fact that you've got different people who tell the same story from a slightly different perspective, which means it comes out in a different way. And I think that's okay. And I think we just accept that and then roll with it.
Yeah. I think is Mark's gospel basically Peter's version, I guess,
That's
from
what
Peter's
tradition tells
perspective?
us. You know, Mark doesn't tell us that, but that's what Christian tradition tells us. So it very well may be true. I mean, the tradition is that Luke gets his information from Paul, although Luke is clear that he investigates all this. So it seems to me it's more than just Paul.
Right.
Of course, Matthew's an eyewitness, John is an eyewitness. They're both of the 12 apostles, so they would have seen things up front, eyewitness, personal accounts. But it very well may be that Mark has got some perspective, at least from Peter, and he tells it shorter than everybody else. So maybe he did
Right.
intend his gospel just to be what it was, and then people come along after him and expand on it, which
Yeah.
that's understandable too.
Yeah. I find it very ironic and funny that verse 7 says, "But go tell his disciples and Peter,
Yeah,
he is going ahead of you." And Peter, make sure we get Peter's name in there. But I think that's
yeah,
because of the
yeah.
reassurance Peter needed from denying him 3 times. So I get that
Oh,
100%.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
So I would have needed that extra recognition, that extra attention, because I would have been still beating myself up, and I'm sure Peter was
Oh,
too.
you know he was. Yeah,
Yeah.
and John makes it clear that he was. Right.
Yeah. So speaking of the women who went to the tomb, was Mary, the mother of Jesus, one of the ones that went to the tomb? This is a question from one of our uh, churchgoers Sunday morning.
Yeah. And it's a good question because so we get Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus' body. So Mary is the most common name among Jewish women in the first century. So there are lots and lots of Marys around. So what we have is Mary
Mhm.
Magdalene. We know that's not Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then we have Mary, the mother of James. Some of the Gospels refer to her as the other Mary. They got so many Marys. It's like, Mary
Right.
Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and that other Mary.
Uh-huh.
So it seems to me that if Mary, the mother of Jesus, were in this group, the gospel writers would have said so. Now we know that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was also Mary, the mother of James. But there's also
Mhm.
lots of Jameses out there. In fact, several
Right.
Jameses in Jesus' own circle. So I don't think Mary, Jesus' mother, is in this group.
Right. And is there any mention of Mary, the mother of Jesus, after the crucifixion? That's also a question
The
from one of
only
our
thing,
listeners.
yeah, the only thing I think we have is she does show up in Acts chapter 1. So post resurrection, she's in Acts chapter 1 when everyone is gone back from the ascension in verse 14, and they're all sort of gathering together, praying, sort of figuring out, okay, what do we do now? I mean, Jesus was dead, he is alive, and now he's given us this charge to go share this message, and now he's gone. So what do we do? Well, Acts 1:14, they all joined together constantly in prayer along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So
Mm.
Jesus' family, who at one time was not sort of all in on Jesus' ministry, at this point is all in on Jesus' ministry because they're
Right.
right there with her and with him, and Mary is one of those.
Yeah. All right. That was a good question. Both of those
It is a good
questions were
question.
very good.
Yeah.
Um, and I think you added the other questions I had on here. Um,
Okay. I answered a lot there in one
yeah.
go, didn't
So
I?
I think you did. Yeah. So, um, and I think I had to, I had to check myself this week, um, from getting mad because I'm a big proponent of women have a purpose in the church and women have a voice and women have a place in service, not just in children's ministry. And I
Right.
really had to fight that defensiveness in myself when I saw the abruptness of Mark's gospel ending, that they went and told no one. I'm like, well, obviously they did, and you used them as a witness because you mentioned their names. So why are you ending it so abruptly and being so um like treating them like they were not doing what they were supposed to do? So, but I grew from that, I think. And I feel like because he used them as a witness, we can know that he wasn't being derogatory or demeaning of these women. He was just abrupt, I guess, on his ending. What are your thoughts?
Well, right. And I think too um there's a sense that he is pointing to this is a scary time. I mean,
Yeah.
remember they're followers of Jesus. In fact, some of these women have
Yeah.
supported Jesus' ministry. I mean, they have made sure he had what he needed during his ministry. So
Mhm.
they could be identified as his followers.
Mhm.
And he was killed 2 days before. So they don't know what's coming next. I mean,
Yeah.
is there going to be a
Yeah.
campaign to wipe out all these
Right.
people? And then suddenly they're in this tomb and his body's gone and they witness this angel. And it is an unsettling
Mhm.
time. And so I think
It
it's
is.
easy
Yeah.
for me, at least, to attempt to put myself in their shoes and go, well, I think I might have been a little bit apprehensive on what to do in that moment as well. And we do know, as we said, maybe Mark's gospel was longer and we've lost part of it. And he went on to say, and you know, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. But when they got back to the disciples, they told, I don't know if that's how it worked.
Yeah.
It's one of those
Yeah.
unknowns. But I don't think that I don't think that we should think any less of them if they were really afraid in this moment, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I'm pretty
I
sure I
agree.
would have been afraid too.
Yeah. Oh, I'm pretty sure I would have been afraid when Lazarus came out of his tomb, let alone having dinner with Lazarus and
Amen.
then seeing Jesus crucified and then seeing that he wasn't
Right.
in his tomb anymore. I mean, just the
Yeah.
idea of that being a reality in your world, in your circle of friends. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, no wonder. I mean, the things that Mark saw or heard and saw in his ministry beside Peter, wow, for him to
Right.
believe all that and know it was true. I mean, yeah, it's just we kind of put it in this book on our shelves or on our desks and we bring it out and try and seek what we can learn about how to live life and who Jesus was, but then it's in a book and it's in our spirit. But man, to see it in those
Yeah.
days would have been,
Right.
yeah. I mean, we talked about the brutality of the crucifixion, but man, the awesomeness of the miracles and the evidence of the power of Yahweh that they couldn't even say his name,
Yeah.
Jehovah, God. I mean, how big he was. And just to live in that century would have been a whole different world than we can even fathom. And I
Oh
love when it
yeah,
comes
it is. You're
alive.
right. I mean, it's we just don't have the eyewitnesses around us. None of us are eyewitnesses to all that, and it would be a very different experience from what we have. I mean, we have the Spirit at work in us. We have Scripture, so we have some things they didn't have, but it is definitely not the same. I mean, we don't have the same life
Mm-mm.
they did, and so we deal with it in a very different way, which makes it interesting.
Right. It does. And I think it also, for me, it gives me a real sense of it humbles me because how can I even
Yeah,
try to understand when, yeah, when their relationship with Jesus was physical, hands on, walking, talking, and they didn't have all of the wisdom of Paul and John and everything that they learned. They were just experiencing it firsthand. And man, what a benefit it is for us to have their experiences to learn from and to grow from.
correct.
I don't know.
Right.
It's just really cool. So Jesus was alive. People saw him, his teachings, his stories, his miracles. They just take on new life for us. And I think that the Easter season just kind of makes it real for us who believe and kind of can make our celebrations that much more special. Um, And because he lives, people continue to talk about him and this story that is worth telling. So, do you have anything more to add, or you want to go on to tell us what the most impactful part of this Easter weekend was for you?
Well, I guess for me this weekend, we can go to that. As a church, it was so nice that we had such great worship opportunities all weekend. So on Good Friday, we had,
Mhm.
as you said, a really good service where we remembered what Christ did on the cross. And then those that were here Saturday with a lot of kids and their families with them.
Yeah,
And, we had Easter eggs and we had pancakes, and that's all good. And the kids love it. And hey, let's do it. But they also
right.
had an opportunity to worship together. And for those that were not in the room when they were worshiping, wow, it was big and it was loud and it was powerful and it was really, really good. And I enjoyed that. And then coming together Sunday morning, again as the church, each one of those was different and really good in its own way. And I think each one of those points to good things at work in our church, and most importantly, God at work in our church. So I'm just really thankful
Yeah.
for God's work in us. But then, our staff worked hard on this weekend, but we had so many volunteers. There's just no way that what happened this weekend could have happened
Mhm.
without many people spending hours and hours preparing for each one of
Yeah.
those events and rehearsing and giving their energy and time. So I'm just thankful for each one of those unique and special worship opportunities this weekend.
Yeah. It was great. I like Friday night when you said you talked about the 8:30 service people and the 10 o'clock service people, because we have 2 services on Sundays. And Friday night, it was both groups coming together, and it was amazing to just worship everybody together, and,
Yeah.
I'm kind of a worship nerd, and just the unity that was there was just it was really,
Yep.
really cool. It was a great experience Friday night.
Totally
I loved
agree.
it.
And,
Alright, so what's
on a
next?
personal level
Oh,
for me,
yes.
no, just on a personal level for me, sometimes I feel like I'm the only common denominator between those 2 hours on Sunday morning, which, uh, I'm insufficient to be the thing that holds all that together. No one person can do that, and certainly not me.
Mhm.
Um, so when we are all
Yeah.
together and we're participating in something as a body, I just think there's such great value in that, and there's a beauty in that, and just being the church in one room, I think is so important. So I
Mhm.
always enjoy it when it's like that. Means a
Yeah.
lot to me.
Yeah. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful worship experience, and I hope that
Yeah,
that this podcast will encourage anyone who wasn't there to try and join us for the next one that the whole church
yeah.
gathers together because it's pretty amazing. Yeah. Mhm. All right. So, what is next for us in our story of God's love uh, um, series that we're on? We're starting something new, right?
So we'll move ahead. Yeah, we are. It'll be the third leg of our journey. We skip some things, which I hate that we have to skip. As a good bit of Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and we go from the middle of Genesis to the beginning of Exodus and talk about how God begins to keep his promises to Abraham as he calls a people. And the main character in that story is Moses, a main single character. I guess the main character as a whole is the people of Israel, but God's relationship with the people of Israel is a big part of what we're getting to and how that connects back to Abraham and then forward to Jesus. So we'll jump into that this Sunday.
All right. All right. Can't wait to see how it all leads back to Jesus.
Yeah.
And we will hopefully hear from you after next Sunday's sermon so that we can answer your questions on Sunday Unpacked. Until then, so long.
Bye bye.